Welcome to Exit Point, a podcast about the advancement of base jumping and the exploration of its culture. I'm Matt Blank, producer and co-host. If you'd like to support this independent production, please visit our Buy Me a Coffee link in the description and leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. In this episode, I'm talking with Sean Devlin, who's a competitive wingsuit base pilot, multi-sport educator, and the current record holder for farthest off landing at Skydive Paris. He's been a dedicated friend within the community for years, and beyond his accomplishments in and out of the sport, we wanted to bring him on to share his perspective on a range of topics, including wingsuit progression, water training for base, and what it was like learning to fly wingsuits as the training methodology started incorporating data-driven analysis. So without further ado, let's get Devlin on the track. So let's jump right into this. Let's attack some of the personal questions first. When did you get into base jumping?
So I started in 2015. I did my AFF in August of 2015 at Skydive San Diego. I think probably like most people got talked into it from a buddy. We were sitting at dinner one night and he just said, "You know what? Like you should really start skydiving. Like we should start skydiving." I was like, okay. And while we were at dinner, he made a call and scheduled me for AFF. And so the next morning I went and did my AFF, and then went the next day, did it, and then really just cranked out student status as quick as I could. And then really dove in pretty hard after that.
What does diving in hard look like?
So I did AFF in August of 15, and by the end of 2015, I had about 270 skydives. I was coaching wingsuiting, I was load organizing. I had my pro rating. Like it was, so I went really, full bore into the sport.
Would you say that you got into most things in life like that, just like at a 45-degree angle?
Yeah, I think that's it. It's pretty fair to say. I'd say like I don't have much desire in doing something like just to get the t-shirt, right? Like my brain I don't find fulfillment in doing something just to be able to say that I did it. If I really want to go do something, I'm going to dive head first and like break it down and try to understand every little bit and piece of the sport, of the thing, of whatever, and really really try to be one of the greats. I think it's definitely a progression and a path to always be continuing down. But like I have very little desire to do something just to be able to say that I did it. So when I made the decision to start skydiving, it was like, no, like I'm doing it.
So what was it about skydiving and base jumping that attracted you after the initial, road from getting it introduced by a friend to taking AFF? Like what was it about skydiving and base that really, enticed you to take this thing on?
I mean, skydiving was always just a path to wingsuit base jumping for me. Like I was, I think you said on one of the other podcasts that, you showed up during AFF and you're like, how do I fly a wingsuit between trees? And everybody was just like, who is this guy? I was also one of those. I think I was probably a little more quiet about it. Like I didn't go around saying like that was my overt goal, but it very much was the goal from day one. Was skydiving to me was always just, I looked at skydiving in the same way that I look at going to a climbing gym. Like it's a place to learn how to be better at something. But skydiving was never that thing that I wanted to be great at. What I wanted to be great at was flying wingsuits in the mountains.
And I know that you've done several other things that were pretty extreme in your, past. You were a motorcycle racer as well as a scuba diver. Is there something that you got out of wingsuit base that was separate from those other things, or was it also like kind of an extension of the same itch to scratch?
I think it was always a different flavor of the same itch. It was always like I didn't want to I just found very little interest in doing the things that like everybody else was doing. Like I always wanted to. I found it just so much more fascinating to stumble on those weird corners of the internet of somebody like diving in caves in Mexico or inside of a sunken submarine, or you see people just riding motorcycles around on the street and you're like, okay, cool, that's neat. But then then you see people racing on a track and it's like, oh, wow, that looks really different. Like, I want to figure out how to do that. And yeah, it's probably a pretty common pattern.
So fill us in on what it was like to get into wingsuit base at that time. 2015, 16 is a time in our like history that we've talked about a lot as being, both incredibly, progressive, like people were on the cutting edge, like razor thin margins, like pushing the limits, but also like a time where a lot of people were getting like seriously injured, and dying. So what was it like to have that goal at that time, both on the drop zone and in the base world?
I mean, I think the sort of most blunt way that I could say it was that I think it was a very clear chapter in base jumping. Like, there was before 2016 and there was after 2016. And that was, as you said, like, it was because people were taking risks that the sport in its entirety didn't understand. Like, connecting with terrain was you would collapse your wing, and that was just how you got onto terrain. That's what if you watch any of those old videos, like, that's what everybody was doing. And if you see that now, everybody is just horrified, like, oh my God, stop doing that. And so it was, it really was because of all of that carnage of that year, the year prior and the year following, that forced the sport, I think, into a bit of a moment of reckoning of like, okay, everybody, what are we doing here? If 30 of the best people on the planet doing this sport all died doing this sport this year, like, maybe we all need to take a step back. And so I think that there was definitely, it was interesting for me coming up at that moment because, as I said, I came into it, really hot and heavy. Like, I was doing about 500 or 600 jumps a year for my first like 5 years in the sport. And I was doing that year round. And so it was this interesting moment where you not only, like myself and those coming up around me, not only didn't have mentors because those that would have been teaching the courses either died or lost several of their best friends. So like pulled back from the sport. And so there was this vacuum in knowledge and expertise at that time, that a few of us like really leaned into and really wanted to try to figure out. And I'm not going to take credit for all of it, but like I was in the room.
Right.
And so, I think one of the things really that a lot of us at that time looked at was, okay, not only like, let's break the problem down in its entirety. Is it how we're flying wingsuits? Is it how we're training in wingsuits? Is it the wingsuits themselves? Like, are we just flying them outside of their window? Is it the terrain that we're choosing? Is it conditions? Like, what are all the things that are causing so much carnage, and how can we reduce that?
Do you remember the statement that out at Paris we were developing West Coast flying?
Oh, yes. Yeah, there was, I loved that. I loved that Paris, like, we got our own, it was just like the Wild West. It was West Coast flying. It was referred to, like, I heard somebody one time say Paris at that time was the Harvard of wingsuiting, and comparisons to the Olympics, of course, right? Like, you go up there and you're like, oh, that's what good looks like. But yeah, I mean, at Paris, we started trying to put together curriculums, and not only what do first flight courses look like, but what does somebody who wants to go and do their first wingsuit base season, like, what are the boxes that they should check?
Right. Yeah, I remember that. Like, people would come from the East Coast and say like, oh, you guys aren't flying wingsuits. Like, you're doing this other type of thing, this West Coast style of flying, which included like, really fast flying through clouds, doing flybys on people, like all this stuff that was markedly different from most of skydiving, which was geared towards formation flying.
Well, and it wasn't, and I mean, to be fair, we were also formation flying, but we were doing it 3 times as fast as what like really a classic FAI acro style of flying would be, right? Which sort of looked like belly and back flying with a lot of fabric on. Like it almost looked like that style of flying wingsuits was almost like flying a camera jacket. And so what we were doing was like, okay, well, that style of flying just killed like 20 or 30 of our friends. So, we want to go fly in the mountains. So how do we do that right? And I think that was really where that was the sort of foundational piece, was like what we were doing wasn't right, or what was being, how people were flying wingsuits before wasn't right. And now knowing what we know, what should we teach? Like, what should we train? What styles of flying should we model for newer jumpers that are coming up? And so, yeah, it was a wild time.
Yeah, I remember a lot of arguments on the drop zone too, and in base, where these conflicting opinions would come to a head, and there would be like these moments where people were like, well, let's just agree to disagree. And you'd be like, no, let's not disagree, like agree to disagree.
Let's not agree. No, we are absolutely disagreeing on this.
Yeah, and it's important that we work it out, because if we don't, then like one of those ways is going to result in somebody getting seriously fucked up.
Well, and I think like one of the things that really started, I think, changing the narrative of the West Coast versus East Coast was, performance flying became more, and I really credit that to WOWs. I think WOWs got a lot of people into performance flying that found PPC flying uninteresting, myself included. And so I think that I definitely credit that, and like, the tireless work of Riddler and everybody that helped him to like really created a generation of performance pilots that were great. And I think that also one of the things that came out of this sort of combining race flying with flocking was that we started being able to pull off maneuvers that you couldn't do if you flew the other way. And I think the one that like stands out to me as a moment in time of like wingsuiting before and after it was, what year was it? Probably 2017 when Micah came back to Paris, and we were doing this dive and flare jump with a bunch of the coaches and a bunch of the organizers. Like it was, I don't know, 20, 23 people, like probably some of the best wingsuiters on the planet at that time. And we're all in this tight group, and we roll into this dive, and Micah's leading it on his back. And so we're in this dive, and dive and flares were not,
standard.
Yeah, we're not standard. Like even that style of jump was like, people were like, wait, what? You're climbing in wingsuits next to your friends? Like, what?
Yeah.
And I remember on this jump, we're all in this dive, like again, of all of the best pilots like on the planet. And Micah's on his back in the same dive. And then we all start to roll out, and on his back, he flares higher than the rest of the group, tucks a double backflip, catches it on heading, and goes back to and is giving people corrective hand signals. And I remember like there were 3 or 4 of us that saw, and like as we're rolling back into, everybody's suits are reinflating, we're getting back and going tight, just looking around, and it was absolute astonishment that like we thought like, oh wow, we are excellent, like we are the best on the planet, and we can climb wingsuits. Like back then was not a super common practice, right? And we do that, and we watch Micah pull that off. It was like, oh, there is a order of magnitude leap in not. And I think the thing that was like the most shocking for us was like, it wasn't that he was in a different suit. It wasn't that there was something magical. Like it was that like his technique was so much better that in the same suit, he pulled off something that not only did we not think was possible, like we wouldn't have jokingly said after a couple margaritas was a thing that you could do. Like it was so far out of the realm of what we understood to be true that I remember a bunch of us just being like, wow, we need to like take a big step back here.
Yeah, totally rethink this thing. I think another interesting point that you brought up, which I'd like to touch back on, is WOWs and PPC. Those are, the competitive elements of wingsuit skydiving. And what I'm hearing from you is basically like there was an argument on the drop zone and in wingsuit base about like what the proper thing was to do. And essentially you're just like, okay, fine. Let's just let the numbers tell the tale. Right. Let's get into performance flying. You do your thing, I'll do my thing, and let's see who wins. Because one of these answers is right, and the one that's right is going to have better numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I think that was definitely it, and I also think context matters. So, what a lot of the people that were having that argument with us were saying was like, well, what we were doing didn't work for FAI acro, and we were like, yeah, you're right. What we're trying to solve for is powerful dynamic flying in the mountains in a sustainable way. And that's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to really understand what wingsuits can do. What is it, like how much energy can you put into this like inefficient, flappy ram air dress? And like, what can you really do with it? Like how fast can these things go?
Yeah.
How far can they go? Like what type of a glide is possible in these things? And so I think really a lot of the testing of that, and then as a group, a lot of us trying to not only, be better individually, but as a group, everybody was trying to progress it. Everybody really compared notes back. Like I think one of the things definitely about WOWs that I loved was it was a super collaborative environment. Like there was no hiding of like fly sites and trying to do whatever. Like it was everybody landed and everybody pulled open their laptops and we all sat and stared at them for 20 minutes and people packed. And then we talked about different things and you'd be like, oh yeah, so you see right here how, you were holding this glide, but then there's this spike in vertical speed. That's because you stalled the suit. And so what happened was you started falling faster. So like, do you remember what that felt like? And you'd be like, oh yeah, I do remember what that felt like. I actually remember in the seconds before that, it just felt like the suit really, it stopped fighting me. Like it just got like squishy and weird. And then all of a sudden I just felt this kind of like, little thing in my stomach. And then I started going again. So like I can remember exactly what that felt like. And so there was this really, collaborative environment where we were all trying to figure out how to be better because we were all intellectually curious about what was possible.
And that seems to be a common thread in the number crunchers. Like if you listen to Dan Darby's episode, he kind of says the same thing, and certainly there were outliers in the other realms. Like, you ran across people like Micah Couch and Scotty Bob and Taya Weiss, who like definitely brought you along and gave you all of the information that they had. Can you also though talk to what it was like to be gate kept? Because I know at that time there were a lot of people that heard your goal and they're just like, no, I'm not going to help you at all. Like you don't understand what you're getting into. You have no idea what it's like out there. Like basically go home, come back to me in like 5 years when you can prove something.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this one a lot. I think my biggest beef with gatekeeping is that it's just ineffective. Like independent of the fact that it's frustrating and whatever else, like it's just ineffective. And so like I can think of a couple different incidents where it was like very to my face. One time of which was at Wingsuit Rally when those used to happen. So we were at Wingsuit Rally at Eloy and there was this panel with a couple really experienced base jumpers. And I remember being so excited to go to this panel. I was like, man, I'm going to learn so much. And like, I'm going to be able to pick the brains of like these guys that I've been watching videos of for years. Like I'm, like a little starstruck and just like, oh, this is great. And I remember on the panel, somebody brought up like, oh, you know what? I think the question was something along the lines of, should you go tracking for just a first season or should you track for a little bit and then fly a wingsuit?
Yeah.
And I think the common practice or the common advice on that has changed over the years. Like I kind of waffle on my own opinion on it. But so at that time it was still just weird. It was a no-go for you to just go fly a wingsuit. that was so reckless for you to do. And I remember I asked the question. So one of them gave the answer of, no, you should just go and do a tracking suit season. You should do a whole season in a tracking suit. And if you go on multiple trips that summer, you should just keep tracking, and you should just keep tracking, just keep tracking. And I'm like, at this point, I'm like, okay, I could understand. I guess I can sort of understand like the concept that you were trying to get to, I guess, but I have 1,800 wingsuit skydives and like 30 in a tracking suit. Why would I go out of the tool that I'm used to and comfortable in into a tool that I'm less comfortable in the mountains? Like, why? I don't understand that. And it was like, well, there's a bunch of things on your first season that like you'll just learn. I'm like, okay.
Yeah. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. Like, what might some of those things be? Like, I believe you. You have several thousand base jumps. Like, I'm absolutely certain that I am missing things. Can you tell me in which genre of things I'm missing? Like, can you give me a loose checklist of like, here are the things that you need to think about on your first season. Here's a set of things that are all going to be very new to you. But instead it was, oh no, well, just go tracking.
Right. That is a really annoying form of gatekeeping, where they like gatekeep the explanation so that you just like have to trust them. And it's like, well, why? Like, I'm risking my life here. Like, I would like a further explanation. Like, I understand that you're trying to tell me something that's going to be helpful, but like you gatekeeping the further explanation of this is not helpful at this point.
I mean, and like, so at the risk of coming off as pompous, like I asked this question in the context of a wingsuit rally at which I was an organizer. And earlier that day, I had put together and structured and led like an 18-way on which both of these jumpers were on the load. So they'd seen me fly wingsuits. They'd seen me problem solve a group and organize a dive flow and structure all of these things together. So they'd seen me not only in like a flying fashion, but in a problem solving, leadership, I guess, instructional setting. And it was still that like I just got this super dismissive answer. And I remember being so frustrated and like so turned off by like both of these guys for years that it was just, I mean, what I would say, I guess to their credit, is it changed the way that I think about answering those questions.
Yeah.
Like when somebody says, hey, should I go tracking or should I go fly a wingsuit? It's like, all right, well, let's talk them through.
Right. And they're individual. It's not like there's one answer for that. Like, no, we have to have a conversation about your experience in the sky and the mountains and all these suits to come up with like the correct answer for you of what you're trying to do and how to get there.
Yeah. And like, what's your experience in both of those tools? Like, because I think for a lot of people, it, or rather, I think probably stated differently. I definitely, and I recognize that I did not fit the pattern of somebody going into wingsuit base jumping sustainably. Like, I went in real full bore, real hot head, but like very analytical. And I think I probably rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because I really just challenged a lot of the dogmatic guidance that I was getting at that time. And I think that really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Like, things like, you shouldn't fly the crack your first year. Like back then was just, that was, if you were flying the crack your first year, you were insane and you were absolutely going to go in. And it was like, okay, but why though?
Yeah.
like what part of that jump is the part where I'm likely to go in? And then the answer that I kept getting back was like, no, like it's just if you go there, like you're gonna die. And I'm like, okay, let me try to ask that question in a different way. If I go there and I'm guaranteed to die, where would somebody find my body? like which part of that jump killed me, right? Like, was it that it was a high alpine environment with a difficult approach? It's not. Was it that the exit is particularly technical and scary? It's not. Is it that the weather there can be very unpredictable? Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that's caught 2 people out in the last 2 years. Is it that the terrain is like really flat and you have to drive in with a ton of energy, or it wraps up around you and it's hard to judge your distance over the terrain? No, neither of those things are true. And so it was like just this legacy sort of like dogmatic view of first season crack equals wrong. And like what I didn't want was a formula. What I wanted was explanations of each of the individual pieces. And so that was frustrating.
So I feel like I have the answer to that, because like I was wingsuit base jumping that area slightly before you came up, and there was a big push to gatekeep that location from newer jumpers because it was at risk of being shut down. Because like so many people were doing different lines that were getting them in trouble, right? And there was that barn line where that person, like the owner of the barn, didn't want you flying by, but it was so sick to like fly by it that like a bunch of people were doing it and posting it. And so I think there was a lot of cultural pressure to keep newer jumpers from that area, just so that they didn't add to the impact, versus like it actually being like that one particular line specifically dangerous. But what I want to get back to is that gatekeeping aspect, and maybe we can attack this from a more general angle. Where do you think gatekeeping should be applied, and where should it not be applied?
Well, I actually think that, so your transition, I think, was actually it just reminded me of something else, which I think goes back to my original point, that I just think gatekeeping is broadly ineffective. And so if what the problem was that was attempting to be solved by saying you can't go there, instead I ended up going there and figuring it out on my own because it was already posted all over the internet. And like, there's a plaque at the exit. Like, what are we trying to hide? But then also, by not knowing that context, like I could have unknowingly put the site further at risk. And so like, if we're going to gatekeep something, right? If there truly is a sensitive exit, then like, okay, then let's gatekeep it. Like, don't put it on social media. Don't bring your friends. Don't keep it actually gatekeep it.
Right. Yeah. You see that in surfing all the time. Like in surfing, you watch on Instagram some epic wave and somebody's surfing it. No one comments where it is. It's not tagged. It's not commented on. Somebody that does immediately gets tarred and feathered. Right.
Yeah.
And thus those like epic scene breaks don't get overcrowded. But yeah, you're right. Like in base jumping, it's kind of the opposite. Like somebody will post this epic video, the exact location that it was, blow it up, and then not give anyone any like extra information about it. So like we kind of have the worst of both worlds. A bunch of people that are like vying for that location with insufficient information to be successful there.
Yeah, and everybody's trying to solve it for the first time. Right? So it's like, instead of, hey, here is a list of things that everybody needs to know about this location, and here are the absolute do and do nots. Instead, everybody's figuring it out from square one. Like everybody's taking their own laser measurements and trying to figure out which weather station is nearest, and trying to figure out the approach, and as a result, taking different routes and having a bigger impact on the environment. Like, that's kind of the piece that I keep just going back to, is it's like, all right, if we're going to gatekeep some things, and I can understand, especially around sensitive objects, I get it. Like I totally understand. But like, I remember when people were gatekeeping Torrey Pines. It was just astonishing to me, and people were like, "Oh, don't talk about it." And so we sort of like kept making jokes about it and like tagging it as downtown LA or tagging it as Mexico. But it was like, it was so obvious where that was. Like, and like the people who opened it posted it on the internet.
Yeah.
So then you're like the 50th, 70th jumper to to jump it, and you're gonna like put your flag in the sand that like, no, this is your exit and nobody else is allowed. Like, come on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe before we move on to this topic, I want to get two specific opinions from you. What do you make of the argument that by adding information, like for instance, Rich Webb put out a ton of information about how to fly a wingsuit, or Brendan Weinstein put a bunch of information about how to find wingsuit exits. What do you feel about the argument that putting information out there like that is in some way facilitating people's experiences that are not ready for it?
I think it's insane. Like I think there are so many holes in that argument. Like, would we also say that because the fly site was invented, now people are flying lines that are more dangerous? Like, the argument doesn't hold water. Like, baseline is bad because now people can see their start arcs and figure out if they could, what their sustainability rate would be on an exit. Like, I just think that, like, people are going to do what they want to do, and people are going to jump exits that they find beautiful or interesting or challenging. And by providing more information, it makes it so that those people don't have to solve it from zero again.
Yeah, see, I like that argument of like, people are going to do what they're going to do. And by gatekeeping the information, like, yeah, you might be saving a small percentage of people who are going to do something outrageously stupid, right? Like the bottom 5%. But you're then leaving behind the 95% of people who want that information for the correct reasons and want to do something sustainably. And you're just kind of telling them like, no, go fuck off. Like, we're not going to share this because we're afraid of the bottom 5% fucking this up for everybody.
Yeah. Like, a piece of advice that I got reasonably early in my career was that whatever problem you're trying to solve, somebody else has already solved it. So like, I mean, unless you're trying to put humans on Mars or something, right? Like, but if you're trying to create a social app, or I work in tech, so like if you're trying to create a social app or do some data analysis or whatever, these problems have largely been solved, or they've been solved in a transferable situation in a way such that like you can learn from their solution and then try, your flavor of it. So, thinking about like, oh, well, we don't want people doing this because if they go down this exit, they'll get hurt. Like, imagine if you went to a ski resort and you take the lift up and you get to the top of the lift and like there were no run signs. Right? Like, yeah. And then like the only way that you could figure out, okay, well, I need to go this way and then I need to turn right at those trees is because like one of your buddies had done it before. And then you're going off of their like subjective, like, oh no, bro, it wasn't too bad.
Well, I think that
that's what we're going to be solving. Like,
yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I think the argument from those people is that by not including that information, you're somehow going to dissuade the people who are not ready by making the barrier to entry even heavier, like the friction heavier. Like, if there's no signs at the top of the run, all these idiots are just going to be scared because they'll get up there and they won't know what to do. And so they'll take the lift down. But like you and I both know that nobody's taking the lift down after that.
That's not happening.
They came to ski.
You're just going to send it.
Yeah.
And you might just end up getting yourself in trouble because you didn't know better. And so like, I go back to like, if we were really worried about something being so full on that we're so worried that people are going to die on it, then we shouldn't be posting it on the internet.
All right, let's deal with the other side of that argument because we just kind of brought that up too. What do you make of the folks that say, if I don't help this person, then they're just going to do it worse without me? And this is applied a lot of times to people giving, personal energy and time or equipment to that person. Like, well, if I don't help them out with this equipment, if I don't like take them to this exit personally, then they're just going to do it without me. What do you believe of that argument? Like somebody holding a gun to your head, right? That like they are otherwise unhealthy or unsustainable, and them telling you like, okay, bro, if you don't help me, I'm just going to fuck this shit up for everybody.
I mean, I would say I haven't encountered that situation myself. But I think, I mean, at the end of the day, people are still just going to do what they're going to do or what they want to do. And so I think that, especially as a more senior member of the sport or someone with information to share, it is your responsibility to share that. Like, I think that it is your responsibility to share that which you've figured out so that somebody else can just start from that. Like, I just feel like by not doing that, it's sort of just like the action sports equivalent of like, well, I walked up to school both in the snow uphill both ways, so therefore you have to, or like things were so much harder for me, so therefore they have to be hard for you. Like, no, like humanity progresses and it makes it better for the next group. And so like,
okay,
yeah,
but I'm gonna challenge you on this one because I know that you have actually met this situation because I have seen you actually engage with this person at Paris. Because, you know, at the time that you were load organizing, I was also there load organizing. And I know plenty of times people have come up to you that were not prepared for the base environment, flying their suits in a radical and crazy way, wanting for you to then facilitate their base experience. And you didn't just tell them, oh yeah, of course, like here's how you do this, here's how you get there. Like, you gave them other information. You didn't tell them fuck off, but you didn't give them the whole ball of wax and the confidence to just go like send it in the mountains.
I guess without knowing, I'm having a tough time with it. But I mean, I guess I would say like I probably got that from Jimmy Puccinati is probably where that I got that model. Because I remember his thing that he used to always do when you'd see people at the bridge, they're like, man, I'm going to do a gainer or I'm going to do a double gainer. And you'd be like, okay, you know, you're an adult, make your own decisions. But, you know, where are you going to be looking when you do that? Oh, well, I'm back. Okay. How many of these have you done before? You know, and he would sort of like, in the very Jimmy, very sweet, but very polite, you're being an idiot sense, you know, like where he would just say, he would lead them to the answer of them saying like, oh, no, I actually like don't, I've got a couple questions here. And I think, I guess, yeah, I'm really grasping it at those other ones, but I think also like, I'm also not afraid of confrontation or like direct conversation, right? Like I have no problem in saying like, no, you're not ready for that. And here's why. Like, here's the list of reasons why you should not do that thing. And then if somebody does it, it's like, okay, well,
I did my best.
I tried. Yeah.
I mean, what I remember you doing is going like, oh, okay, that's what you want to do. All right, show me you can do this, right? And show me that on the next jump. And if you can do that, then I'll show you the next thing. But somebody that came to you and was like, yo, show me this exit point. And you're like, well, I don't even know you, you know? And they're like, well, if you don't tell me, like, I'm going to just go do it. And you're like, okay, look. Why don't you show me something and give me the confidence to like, give you the next piece of information?
Give me a little bit of context of like, I guess, yeah. And I think part of that is it's also like, I think I generally approach most problems, not only in like, how do I learn them myself, but in how to explain them is like from an instructional, educational basis. And I think one of the most important things of being an instructor is meeting people where they are. And if like, I have no idea who somebody is and they come up to me and like, hey, I want to go, you know, goalpost trees on this one line. Like, I don't know how to explain that to you because I don't know from where we're starting.
So let's get into some of that educational stuff. First, I want to ask, just as like a personal question, what were some of the other lessons aside from the one you just mentioned that Jimmy taught you that really served you in your later base jumping career, if we can call it that? And we'll get into that word in a second. But yeah, were there any early lessons that like kind of you held on to through the entire progression?
For sure. I think anybody who met Jimmy has things that sit with them. I would say, I mean, a couple of things started before that. And one of them was advice that you gave me early on, which was there's no such thing as a mulligan. There's no mulligans in this.
There's no mulligans in base.
There's no mulligans in base. And I think one of the things that was a great exercise that we did that got me very comfortable and very confident under a parachute specifically was the contest where we would have landing accuracy contests on every jump, like period, paragraph. There's no, oh, but no, I don't want to. It's like, no. And this was from jump 35. Like, I think I was doing this on student gear.
Yeah. I remember we almost lost a friend doing that one. Can you fill in the gaps here? Like, what was the contest? What were the stakes? And what was the time in which, like, you definitely imposed, and so did the rest of us, the rule, there are no mulligans.
Okay, so the context was, it was always, we would pick a target and there was no mulligans. Furthest buys closest to drink. Like, that's it. And you know, the drink could be beer, it could be a fizzy water, it could be a Gatorade, you know, a Diet Coke and tacos afterwards, whatever. But it was just every jump, you know. And so if we did 12 jumps that day, it was like those were 12 accuracy contests that day. And one day we were doing a wingsuit formation off, and we ended up as was of course tradition, we ended up pretty far off from Paris, and oh man, I'm gonna omit some of the details, but I think so. We go, and then there was a cutaway.
Yeah, I can fill in the gaps on that.
Yeah.
So the gap on that was that one of the people on this jump was also working with a student, and they agreed to be part of the accuracy contest, even though they were like floating on the outside of the formation. And the student had a cutaway, and then the instructor, as is, you know, customary,
did the reasonable thing
and followed him off to the drop zone to land with them to make sure that they were safe. But
he landed further than the student. Yeah, I remember when we got back, it was like, well, who was further?
Yeah, and he's like, well, I was, but I had to land with the student. We're like, okay, you owe a drink. And they started to protest, and we're like, look, no. There are no mulligans in this game. There are no mulligans in this game. You had the opportunity to land inside of the student. You could have landed closer to the target than them.
4 feet closer.
4 feet closer. He would have owed the drink. I'm sorry. There are no circumstances like base jumping that will like save you from the consequences.
Yeah, there were no asterisks on this contest, and yeah, that one got a little heated. But
I like that one. So that was one of the lessons that you carried through, was like, there are no mulligans in this sport.
There's no mulligans in the sport, and also like canopy accuracy really matters. Like, if you know another Jimmyism, he described base jumping as a really scary approach to a really scary canopy flight, and he was like, that's the sport. So if you were comfortable on scary approaches and you were comfortable flying parachutes in scary situations, then like you'd be okay. But I think that was one of the things that definitely stuck with me very early on. And then I think one of the other pieces was, you know, as I said, I'm very comfortable and confident under canopy. I did my base first jump course, I think in March of 16, like again, still less than a year into parachutes. And I was within 2, 3, 4 feet of the accuracy target on every jump, except on, I think it was jump 12. I made the classic student mistake of overcommitting to the target. So we had, you know, the target out in the sort of main spot by the flag. We were doing rear riser stalls, and I just lost way more altitude than I was planning on. And in my head, I had it as like a point of pride that I landed at the accuracy target every time. And I didn't make the decision fast enough that target is now like, that's off the table. There's no chance that I can get to that now. And instead I should be accurate somewhere else. And I didn't do that. And instead I went into the ditch, you know, between sort of that the bridge goes over, or the tiny little wood bridge goes over, and ended up spraining my ankle pretty bad on my FJC. And so I take the day off and sort of hobble out from underneath the canyon and talk to Jimmy on that. And he basically just, you know, gave me some really good advice that was like, at any point in the jump, there are a certain number of things that are just no longer possible. And you should always sort of think short, especially in base. I think in parachutes broadly, but always think short. Like look for something that's closer. Don't try to outfly something. And I think another piece was like he said, he was like, I'll visualize kind of the 5, 6, 7 possible outcomes when I exit. So, and for deployment specifically. So he was like, I will have the plan in my head of what happens if I have a on heading opening. What if it's a 45 left? What if it's a 45 right? What if it's a 90 to either side? What if it's a 180? And what are the things that change in that decision tree? And that I think also really stuck with me. And I think anybody who shared an exit point with me, you'll probably notice, if you didn't before, you probably will now. Before exit, you'll see me visualizing it, and I will like be playing it out. I'm doing it now as I'm talking about it, like with my hands on, okay, I'll be grabbing, like this is a double rear riser, or I'll grab toggles, or I'm doing, it's going to be just this, and I'm going to fix heading to 45 right or whatever. And I do that on every jump. And I think that was definitely one of those moments of coaching from him that's really, really stuck with me.
Any other key lessons that you've carried with you throughout your entire career, quote unquote?
Man, I don't know. I think probably the other one that I sort of had before, but also was another Jimmyism, was like to just not take anything that's told to you. It was like, always ask why. And I think this is one of my like big beefs with the community, is like always ask why. And I think that by not doing that, we do a disservice to the community, of just passing on bad information.
Yeah.
Or incomplete information, or contextually relevant information. And I think,
or information that's just not based on anything that you truly understand. And I remember saying this to you when you've cleared your first jump course, and then you were off with like me and the rest of the gang, and we started jumping together. And I was like, yo, dude, rule number 1 here is don't trust me. Yep. You can have faith that I'm like, telling you the right thing, right? But until it becomes your own information, your own knowledge, then don't apply it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think rule 1, don't trust blank, was kind of like a joke for a while.
Yeah.
But I think it really was rooted in that same piece of, well, but why? But why?
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important questions to ask, especially when you grow accustomed to just taking somebody's word for things because they are experienced, because they are, somebody that you look up to that like has been in the game as long as Jimmy. It's easy to just be like, oh, well, Jimmy said it, so of course it's right. Versus like, well, but I also need to understand why that's right, or if it's not completely right, the gap that's there.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I'm sure we'll get to in a second, but I think like I have a very mathematical and scientific approach to most things, independent of parachute sports. And one of the things that my brain loves about math is that something is either true or it is not. And if something is true, if something is objectively true, then it's always true. And so I think that a lot of the time there are, I think there are very few objective truths in parachuting, especially in base jumping. Because I think most things that are presented as such are wrong, or are like woefully lacking information, or are obfuscating information. Like, I think the classic one that really drives me up a wall is body position causes off headings.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, does it? And then, it's, you go down the path of, okay, well, what does cause off headings? Well, it's packing, or it's body position. And of course, everybody's going to say that they're the greatest packer ever. So it's definitely not my pack job that caused that. And so I think that, in saying, oh, well, body position, why did I have this 90 right? Why did this happen? Oh, you probably had a shoulder dropped. Like, well, if that was true, then it would always be true.
Right. I could always drop a shoulder and it would always turn that way.
It would always do that. And anybody who's watched anybody at the bridge do an aerial knows you can pitch in, like, I've seen some absolute chaos body positions and canopies open stone cold on heading.
Right.
Like I went off the, God, what's the thing? The
trap
the
door.
Trap door.
Yeah.
You were there for that. That was the single scariest base jump of my career up to that point. And so I went off the trap door, right, which is like this little plank with a
lever handle
with a lever behind it, that
dunk tank type of thing.
Yeah, so it's like a duck tank off of the bridge. And so you go off of it, and I just ended up in like this seated backfly position, and I tried to roll over, and I end up it's on my Instagram. It's like it is the worst body position I've ever pitched a parachute in, and I got absolutely ragdolled on opening, but like the parachute opened straight. And so it's like, okay, well, that's probably not what's causing off headings. Like, or, if you want to be sort of scientific about it, like I was like, okay, actually, how much does body position matter when you deploy? So like I went skydiving with my base parachute, and I went out and just did like what's the thing where you pull up one knee and like
Pike?
jump into a pool?
Yeah, a pike.
Yeah, like a pike or like a can opener or whatever.
There we go.
Do that on deployment. And if body position was bad, like if body position caused off headings, you should be able to 100% of the time cause an off heading with that, right?
Yeah, or when like Will Mitchell like offsets the shoulders of a rig by like a good 6 to 10 inches, and like mechanically, but still the canopy opens.
Still
on
canopy
heading.
open straight.
Yeah, and you're like, huh.
And so like I think that as a community, by not just saying like what causes off headings, we don't know. Like that's a scary answer.
Yeah, totally.
But by not saying that, it prevents people from trying to figure out what actually does cause them.
Yeah. Also, like it allows for less complacency, because if you heard like, oh, body position is 100% the thing that causes off headings, then you work really hard on that, and you don't really work very hard on anything else because you think that you're covered. And lo and behold, like you're going to get 180s. Versus if you heard, well, we don't really know what causes off headings, then it's like, oh shit, well, now I need to go to the next level of contingency, which is I'm definitely going to get an off heading.
Absolutely. Like
I need to be a dope dick canopy pilot so that when that happens, it's not an issue.
Yeah, like I should assume that off headings are going to happen. And then when they do happen, then I will fix them, go, whew, that was scary. And then go land and repack and like grab a soda and try it again, right? Like, but yeah, I think and that's the thing that really like bugs me with this, the sort of passing on of either outright dogmatic or oversimplified information, is that it prevents people who are curious, who would be interested in trying to solve this problem. It prevents them from having any desire to go solve it, because you're like, oh, well, it's already solved, I guess, and I just need to fix my body position.
So let's talk about that for a second, because you do have a more curiosity than most people, and maybe we can bring your actual career into this question. You are by career a risk management manager.
Yeah.
Has your career in risk management somehow given you a better platform or a mentality that's helped you in base jumping?
So in my current role, I think that'd be reasonable to say. So I guess taking a step back on what is my career and what do I do. So I've worked in tech, specifically in early stage tech, throughout the entirety of my career. I've been an entrepreneur. I've started, I think, about 5 companies since college with varying degrees of success. I've worked at early stage businesses through pre-IPO, and I've worked as a consultant. I've helped people prepare for fundraising. I've helped people raise money. I've helped people build and structure executive teams and get companies up and going so they can raise money and fund the company. And I've broadly worked in kind of the intersection of product management, operations, and strategy. And so for those who are less nerdy than I sort of generally have worked at or worked on problems wherein we identify some need, there's some problem that exists out there, and then come up with a set of possible solutions to it, and then manage the execution and delivery of that solution.
Also, let me just bring this one down to earth for a second. When I was living with you, you were also working on a payments company and developing products and managing the risk for those products, to the tune of like, if you got something wrong, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars would be lost.
Yes.
And so you had to assess those problems and say, like, how do we mitigate our risk in these situations? Like a single decision could be catastrophic to a company, or a single strategy could be catastrophic.
Yep, absolutely. So I was working at a company providing software to plumbers, basically. And I built up and grew the payments business for that company. So if a plumber comes to your house and they fix your water heater, how do you pay them? Well, you pay them with a credit card. Well, okay, how does that happen? And how does that money get to the plumber? I built that business out for this company. And as part of that, there's in any payments business, there's the risk of fraud. And fraud is a really hard problem to solve. It's a moving and evolving problem. And I think in that one specifically, some of the early guidance that I got from some very great mentors that I had was, on any solution that you have, you're wrong. And it's your job to go figure out why you're wrong. So like it was the antithesis of being dogmatic. Like, we figured out how to stop fraud. No, you didn't. Someone is going to beat it. You need to go figure out how.
So did that mentality help you in base? Because it is starkly contrasted by most of our culture, which is like somebody sticking up their hand and saying, I'm right. And then when somebody says, I think there's something that you're missing, they go, no, I'm better than you. And I'm not.
I mean, I think that like I fall back to the sort of scientific method on some of these things, right? Which is that the method being that you shouldn't try to prove something correct. You should keep trying to prove it wrong. And then something becomes correct because you can't prove it wrong. Like gravity. Like, we know that gravity behaves in the way that it does because nobody has been able to prove it otherwise, despite a lot of different attempts to do so, right? And so if it, like, taking that approach of, instead of what data points can I find to support a narrative that means I can survive this jump, instead of thinking of it from that angle, thinking of it as, what can I prove that I won't?
Yeah.
And I think that is, that's something that is definitely in my style of how I assess wingsuit jumps and wingsuit performance, and my level of currency in a wingsuit, how I assess exits. So I think that piece, like sort of taking the scientific method approach, as well as understanding and recognizing statistical significance and variances in sample sizes.
So like, let's speak to that one real quick. You mean like when somebody comes up to you and goes, hey, this is the way to do it. And you go like, why? And you're like, well, because it's never gone wrong for me. And then you go, well, how many times have you done this? And they're like, 70. And
yeah.
like,
I mean, or somebody will go like 3,
right.
And I think that this is the one place where I would say that, that too much information may be wrong. Like, this is the one, I think, argument that I can understand. I still ultimately disagree that more information is bad, but I think one place that I've definitely seen it in the last couple of seasons, especially in the Valley, is somebody saying, "Oh, hey, I've started my suit at this speed, like, or this pace, right? Like I can do a 148 meter start or something." And it's like, wow, that's a pretty good start. How many times have you done that? And I'm like, oh, I did it twice. Okay, well, what about all the other ones? and what were all of the things that went into that? And like, I think this is one of the things that really is very, very common in fraud management specifically, is that there is very rarely a single data point that will tell you something either is or is not fraudulent. And what you end up having to do is have this combination of 30, 50, 70, 125 inputs, and certain combinations tend to, over time, be more indicative of something being fraud or not being fraud.
So like when you're like trying to assess for yourself whether you are a quote unquote fraudulent wingsuiter, you're looking at like many more than one data point of like, well, did I accomplish that task on this one jump? You know, could I fly high nose? Great. Okay. Does that mean I can go fly in Brabant? Well, that's only one data point. So like, no, I haven't proven that I'm not a fraud yet. Like I need to go like do like 100 different things to eventually come to the conclusion that I'm ready for this.
Yeah. So I've one, I think like a very specific example of this, which was, I forget when it was, but for a while I was on this kick that, thermals don't matter. Like that heat on a face of an exit doesn't matter because and my rationale was our wings are too inefficient. They're too inefficient. And there's too many other combinations of things that go into a start arc. So therefore, thermals are just one of, 10 major contributing things. And so my hypothesis was, I think people put too much credit into thermals in their assessment of an exit.
And what did you find out?
They really matter.
And more importantly, how did you find that out?
So what I did was I work remote, and I've really structured my life in such a way that I can pursue base jumping reasonably full time. And so I was in the valley, and I was there for several months. And what I did was I would get up and I would go and jump high Lamoose every day 4 times. So I would get up and catch like the same train. I would catch the 8 o'clock train, or up to that side of the valley, I think it's at 8:30. I would catch the same train for all 4 of those jumps. And I would get up and I would try to hike it at about the same pace, like just north of an hour. And I would try to get up and have about the same amount of water. I would eat lunch at the same day. I was like, I want to understand what happens here. And I flew the same line, like just straight out over the middle of the valley, like nothing interesting, no subterminal left, just very methodical and exceedingly monotonous exercise. But so I did it 80 times. And so what I found was I was about 15%, I had about a 15% faster start arc in the early afternoon, just after the valley had crested and the sun was hitting that face. And so that I was about 15% better, pretty much across the board. And at this point, my starts were all pretty uniform. And it was like this one window of time. The third and fourth jumps of the day had similar performance to the first one of the day. And it was just that second jump of the day, it was about 10 to 15% better. And it was specifically between 200 and 300 meters of fall. And so that I thought was an interesting finding, which was that in the first 100, 200 meters, right, like you're still just building airspeed. And so that really was my original hypothesis, was like, this wing is too inefficient. Like wind coming up at 10, 15 knots, like isn't going to make a difference. And in that part of the start arc, it didn't. But what I did see was once that suit starts flying, like the drive that I would get was demonstrable. Like it was statistically significant. And in like classic sort of data analyst nerd status, I have all these things in a massive spreadsheet. Like I also use Baseline, but I keep everything in a spreadsheet because I like to just really nerd out on it. I'll clean that spreadsheet up and publish it someday. But like that I thought was really interesting. And then also looking at, other things of like, how different are suits?
Yeah.
Like what does my start arc look like in my ATC that I had 1,400 skydives in versus my C3, versus my A5. Like what were the real differences between those suits? And that was another thing that I think was like really fascinating, was like plucking out some of those things.
So you go off to basically prove yourself wrong on this by applying the scientific process, which I think is great and something that all too often is left behind. Like people have a hypothesis and then they just go on their merry way until something like comes to really like challenge them, versus like going out to try and like understand and prove yourself wrong or right. And I know that you've also given a lot of credit to people in our community that have like raised their hands with an assertion so that people could prove them wrong. Can you expand on that and why you respect that and why you think that we might not be doing enough of that?
Absolutely. So one of the things at the previous company I was at was there was this saying amongst the founding team, which was, it's better to be wrong than vague. And it became this sort of cultural anchor for this company. And we asked it in every interview question, or in every interview. And we would just say, like, is it better to be wrong or vague? And the great people would just say, it's better to be wrong. And be like, oh, why is that true? Like, because wrong you can learn from. And vague, you can't. There's not something to react to. It's like this squishy thing that you just like, and so as a result, you either A, are not communicating whatever thing you were trying to effectively, or B, everybody ends up wasting each other's time because you don't go anywhere. And so I think one of the things that, again, as a sport or as a community, I don't think we do particularly well. I think that there are a few people that have done it really well. Like I think Rich Webb posting Top Gun Base, there was a before and after that, right? Like that changed the way that we talk about and think about wingsuits and how we think about energy management and like talking about differences between like pitch and chord. These are like the right words to use to discuss something so that we can try to prove each other wrong, and in doing so, learn something.
So how do you get over that fear of being wrong? Because a lot of people have their reputation wrapped up into being right, and so they would rather be vague and not wrong than wrong and somehow lose credibility.
Man, I think it's one of those things you sort of need to just do. And also, like, is that the thing that we're worried about as a community? Not like not dying because I made a dumb mistake because somebody else could have said like, hey, this is wrong. Like, you're thinking about this incorrectly. Like, are we worried about being embarrassed? Like, is that really in this sport, that's the thing that we're worried about? With how much everybody posts on the internet? Like everybody keeps posting these unicorn videos, like backwards facing on their wingsuits, like, and we're worried about like being embarrassed. I don't know, but I mean, I would say like, I think that holistically, people are bad at creating. Like, I think creating from a blank piece of paper is a really difficult talent to have. And not a lot of people can create from like what I generally refer to as like a blank page problem. And I think I have a lot of respect for, and I would say like a thing that I found success, I think probably one of the biggest drivers of success in my career is I think I'm pretty good at that. And so by getting a set of ideas down onto paper, into a slide deck or something, and then letting people react to it, I think people are very good, or it's easier for people to react to somebody else's work. Like, it's easier to criticize somebody else's work than create something anew. And out of that, like, if you're the one that created this thing, I think it's really easy to take that personally and be like, oh, like these people found problems in my logic or whatever. It's like, well, yeah, but by putting yours out there, you progressed the conversation.
Right. And I think that was one of the key issues when the Squirrel guys put out the tension knot study
Yep.
And like they got fucking lit up because a bunch of people came out of the woodwork like, this isn't a study, this isn't statistically significant, this would get ripped apart if it were introduced in a scholastic environment. And that wasn't their point. Their point was just to put an anchor point on the map for people to then iterate off of. They knew that it was like completely flawed in its scientific process, but it was like the best that we could get at that time. And so like they were unafraid to like just put it out and be like, hey, like, look, like we can't draw strong conclusions here. This is the best we could do.
But here's what we learned.
And
I think even in that, there were already 2 or 3 like shockingly interesting findings. And I think before I go to those, like my kind of counterpoint back to everybody that was criticizing was like, all right, cool. Where's your study?
Right. Yeah. Just take this and punt it a little further, carry the ball a little farther. Like, let's go.
Yeah. And so I think like I've nothing but respect for the guys on that one. Nothing but respect for Rich Webb's putting his flag in the ground. And I think, again, going back to the one that it always rattles around in my head, if something is true, then it must always be true, right? Is the sort of dogmatic answer of, oh, well, if your lines are twisted, then sort of fill in the blank, right? Like terrible things will happen if your lines are twisted. And I'm a chronic non-line untwister. And so one of the things that I thought was so like funny, honestly, from that study was like how Will attached one to a drill bit and twisted it up like 1,000 times or something. Like, was it? It was something insane.
Yeah.
And then what happens? Can't be open straight. Can't be open straight. And you're like, oh, okay. Which I think then goes back to, and one of the things that I think they did really well in that study was just be blunt about, we don't know. Sort of in the same vein of what causes off headings. We don't know. It's like, that's a scary answer. So then, it sort of then begs the question, okay, who else wants to pick up the ball and try to figure this out?
Well, speaking of picking up the ball, at one point you picked up the ball pretty hard in education in air sports. What led you to want to be an educator in air sports?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was 2016 and 17, and I think that a lot of things there were a few pieces that like we just weren't getting good answers on. And so specifically with like the course that we put together, that, and so I don't remember if we talked about yet, but in college I was a scuba diving instructor. I have done scuba dives of all types, from basic sport diving through technical diving, through mixed gas and closed quarters, inside of caves and sunken ships. And I also spent, I think, about 2.5 years in an instructional role. And so there were some things that we kept seeing that sort of all just came to a head at the same time. Like, we were at a bridge trip and we watched 3 people go into the water and nearly drown, had to be legitimately rescued. And then I went on a trip by myself to the bridge and saw 2 more people do that. And then I was in Europe the next summer and saw somebody have to get drug out from Campione in a tracking suit by one of the harbor workers. And like this guy was completely underwater and drowning. And this guy, like just a local, pulled this jumper out of the water. And I started sort of asking the questions of like, well, what should the guidance be?
Yeah, I mean, we know what it is. I mean, what do you make of the B license water training that everyone gets put through as like the checkbox for you've been trained for the water?
I don't think it trains people for the water. Like like it just doesn't train people for the water. Like if you're not, and why do I think that matters? Well, like, we went to answer the question of like, well, what are the problems of landing a parachute in water and how bad can it go?
All right, well, let's fill some of those in. So how did you develop this water training course?
Well, so, I mean, I approached it from the angle of, I wanted to come up with a curriculum that would make it such that the sort of learning objective was that people coming out of the course would be as educated about landing in water as a potential landing area as they would about landing on land. That you could stare at it, see it not as a thing that isn't land, but see it as a potential landing area and judge it for its pros and cons.
Yeah, we see that a lot. You talked about people nearly drowning in the water. And I think, there are a fair amount of people that nearly go into the water, go in like in water. I know that I've rescued a couple of people over my career that if we weren't on the shoreline watching it happen, I don't know if they would have survived. But I see many more people get injured trying to avoid the water.
Yeah.
Like they don't feel safe or comfortable landing there. And so they force a landing into the trees or into a rock garden or whatever else is around that's 100 times worse than if they had just been comfortable swimming.
Yep. Or if they just had a little bit of familiarity of that body of water. Like at the bridge, it blows me away watching the people dodge landing right on the shore. Right? Like if you go just off of that shore, it's like knee high and squishy mud with like grass in it. It is a exceedingly soft landing area that if you're close enough to like the beach, then you don't have to swim. You don't have to like, and you can hit that pretty hard and be okay. But because people just have in their head, and I think it's like, again, my hypothesis was, and sort of goal in creating the course was that people just don't know. And so they just look at the water as lava.
Scary. Yeah.
And it's this thing that under no circumstances should I land in. And it's like, well,
what are some scary things about water that are not actually true? I know that you went over like a fair few of these things before getting students actually into the water, which were actually really helpful for me to learn too. It like reduced my fear of the water substantially, but they were just technical things about the human body interacting with water that were just kind of helpful to know in the back of your mind.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's the first thing is that you have time. I think is like one of the first things that we go over in the course that really blows everybody's mind, which is that the average person under average circumstances, like reasonably athletic, can hold their breath for 3 minutes.
If forced to.
And like, that's not going to be fun. It's going to be painful and uncomfortable, but you have 3 minutes to solve a problem while underwater. So that's independent of you can pop your head back up and do it. I think that's really point A is you have way more time to solve this problem than most people give themselves credit for. I'd say the second thing is that humans are pretty buoyant. We've all been kids and been in pools or the ocean or whatnot, independent of, jumping in hiking boots and other things that you may have on you at the time that will reduce your buoyancy. Or may increase your buoyancy depending on what's with you, is that if you just sort of take a deep breath and you're upright in a water column, a normal person will float at about their eyes. And so if you're in salt water, it's right about your mustache. So if all that you need to do in order to float as a human is take a deep breath and slightly cock your head back, like that's sort of all that you need to do. That's not to say that that's all that you need to do to solve the problem.
Right. But just understanding that kind of avoids a lot of panic. I remember, watching students kind of come to that realization as they were just floating in the water with you and going like, wow, like this is a lot less scary than I would have thought. And just for the sake that I know that these two things are real. Maybe you can also speak to the couple of things that you pointed out about them with equipment in the water before you jumped in with them.
For sure. So, I mean, one of the other things is there's like a lot of the things that we have with us actually work pretty well as buoyancy devices. So there's a couple different ways of doing this. Like there's 1,000 videos on YouTube of drown proofing. The military teaches a lot of these things like that then, became into the scuba diving progression. That is where I learned it. And that like most hiking pants, as an example, if you can get your pants off and tie the legs together and do one sort of big swoop, you get a pretty great
PFD.
Like it will hold you up comfortably. It's also possible to do this with shirts. Shirts are a little bit tougher. They're a little bit trickier.
Or the stash bag was the best one that I saw you do.
Stash bags are astonishingly good at this.
And they're right there in that stash pocket. Like deploying that was so quick.
Exactly. I mean, if like if you're jumping slick or however you're jumping, if your stash bag is, on your lower back, it is not particularly difficult to grab that. And it's a bag already, right? And it's made of ripstop. And so you take one quick, again, like kind of overhead swing, imagine your visualize like a big net trying to catch a butterfly.
Yeah.
You do that and put it down in the water, you're going to catch a lot of air and give yourself a massive PFD. Like I think we had 2 or 3 people hanging from one pocket stash that had holes in it.
Right.
Like it was really astonishing how successful some of these things were. Like specifically, I think stash bags like really blew both of us away.
Totally. Which is like another cool thing. Like if you end up wanting to rescue somebody and you don't have flotation, grab your stash bag. That way, like when you get out to them, you can do that little trick, hand it to them while you're trying to help them solve the problem. So that's some flotation. I think there was also a shirt one that you went over. Like, so you can make flotation out of your shirt, your pants, your stash bag. How about the equipment that's trying to kill you?
So I know that was one of my favorite both lines to say and stare at your face every time that I said it, which was that parachutes and base gear and a lot of the other gear that you're jumping with, think helmets and knee pads and hiking boots and poles. These things are designed to help you in air. And they are, by design, intended to be equipment that is trying to save your life. So if at the moment it starts trying to kill you, you should treat it as such. Right. Like you should get away from it. Like the second that this thing is trying to pull you underwater, you need to get away from it. And not think like, oh, it's my gear, whatever. Like a lot of the time we're jumping near lakes and harbors or these big sort of semi-stale bodies of water. And like, it's not going to go anywhere.
So speaking of getting away from the gear, there were 2 really helpful suggestions that you made for people when they were wrapped in canopy and wrapped in lines, which are like the 2 scariest positions to be in.
Yep.
Can you go over those? For
sure. So I think so sort of tackling them one by one. The one of being wrapped in a canopy. I think this one it's horrifying. Like I really don't know how else to describe it, because what happens is as you
displace.
As you go into the water and are wrapped by the canopy, the water is trying to displace everything that's in it, right? Like the water is trying to force you out of the water. And in doing that, it forces all of the air out of the canopy. And so what happens is it vacuum seals to your hand. And the first time that happens, like it is a deeply unsettling sensation.
Oh yeah.
Like it is. It's you really can't describe how unsettling it is. But so I think a lot of people, and this is what we saw, right, was that you would try to fight it. And by trying to fight it and pull out, there's nothing to pull against in the water. And so unless you find your other hand and grab your other hand, then you can give yourself something to pull your arm out from. And you're not just trying to tread water with a vacuum sealed thing around your hand, right? Like your hands will still behave as hands, even though they have this canopy vacuum sealed around them.
Yeah, I took that one to the bank. That one was really helpful when I jumped into the canopy, just like flat backed it into it. And
what happened?
Well, the first time I did it, you had to rescue me because it like completely vacuum sealed me. And I was like, oh my God, I have no idea how to get out of this. I don't know which way is up. This is crazy. Which is, why we did this training with, rescue divers and all of this, But the second time, and like really focusing on the task at hand, knowing that was really helpful, And like, I love the, little kind of aside that you made. You're like, look, you don't just stop using your hands when they're in mittens, do you? No, like they're covered in fabric and yet they are still hands and very useful to solve problems. So just treat the canopy like that. Yes, it's covered in fabric, but it can solve a ton of different problems if you just work on them.
Yeah, like your hands will still be hands. And that was definitely point one. That one took that one also, I think, like to sort of circle back to how you said that the first time that you did it required a legitimate rescue. Like
Yeah.
you were not okay.
I mean, that was the philosophy of the course itself, right? Was to get it as close to game day as possible. That standard B license training where like you have a bathing suit on, no shoes, and you jump in very controlled and then swim underneath a canopy to the other side. Like that's nothing. That is not even close to the scariest thing that could happen in the base environment. And like,
and if that does happen, rad.
Yeah. Great.
Sweet.
Yeah.
But if the scary thing happens and you haven't trained for it, then like, what are you going to do?
Right. And so like the idea was to make it as scary as possible while we were in the controlled environment. That way, when we end up in the chaotic environment, we don't panic.
And I think one of the other pieces of that was that, like, we went in to sort of write the curriculum with this idea of, oh, here's exactly how we're going to train it. And out of testing it a bunch, you and I in pools for hours, we learned the best way, I think, for both of us to confidently not only demonstrate, but provide, like, here's the best way that we've found to solve this problem. Here's a couple of things you should think about. And here's, here, let's try it. And I think that, I would say that was definitely one of the big learnings coming out of it was like our original hypotheses weren't totally right.
Yeah.
Right. Like we thought like, oh, you should just be able to swim out of this thing. Like, not really. Like if it's around you, it's around you. And that's a problem that you then need to sort of solve in sequence.
Let's talk about lines for a second too, because that was another big take home that I think you introduced in the classroom environment, which is totally transferable on the podcast about how to manage lines.
Yeah, I think so. Really, I think there's two pieces of it. So there's what happens with lines when you're not moving, like say you land in a lake or you're in a pool, or what do you do with lines if you're entangled in them and you're in moving water? And the answer to both of those things is sort of different. And so first of all, like what happens with lines in water? Well, what happens is they all sort of suspend themselves in this sort of beautiful spider web underneath the canopy. Like they all don't float at the surface and they all don't sink. Like the risers or the container will pull them down, or you underwater will pull them down, and they sort of just loosely float around. And in the same way that when you're scuba diving in a kelp forest, there is kelp that's sort of just floating around everywhere. And what is the worst thing that you can do while scuba diving in a kelp forest?
Kick around.
Kick really hard. Because what happens?
You create vortices.
Exactly. So in the same way that when you're falling through the sky, you create a burble that comes off behind you, when you're swimming through the water and you have fins on or you have boots and you're kicking around in the water, you're like creating these little vortice waves coming off of your feet. And what happens in the same way that if you have a bad pitch in a wingsuit and the pilot chute gets sucked back towards you, that's what happens. And so if you kick around, you're trying to do like a full water polo, like egg beater style treading water, what ends up happening is you just wrap yourself in lines.
That is exactly what happened to this guy that me and Brian Mosbaugh had to rescue at the bridge. Perfect landing. He had his equipment already dialed. He actually had flotation too. Like he had flotation. He had no boots on. He was wearing a swimming suit, and he just started like treading water, trying to get out of his equipment so he could grab the tail. And like we yelled over to him like, "Hey, are you all right?" He's like, "Yeah, I'm okay." And then like about 15 seconds later, we see him start like going under the water. And what had happened was he was treading water so closely to the lines that it completely wrapped up his legs. And then all of a sudden he like was reaching down to try and undo his legs with his arms. And then his arms got caught in the lines as well. And then he ended up just this ball of mess that was like floating upside down with this flotation. And we're like, oh my God, go, go, go,
Oh
go.
no. Yeah, and I think one of the other pieces to that is also in the intro to the course is that water doesn't drown people. People tire themselves out and then as a result drown. And so one of the pieces to that, like, is like, okay, well, if the way that I end up drowning in water is I end up tiring myself out such that I can't tread water anymore, right? So then it's, okay, well, how can I exert the least amount of energy? And so one of the things I think also that really that was a learning for me coming out of the course that I didn't expect was how to get out of a harness.
Yeah.
Right. And so that was another one. I think that like a lot of people would assume that you tread water upright in the water column and you try to take off the container in the way that you would if you were standing upright on the ground. But again, keeping in mind, like you kicking your legs around. Oh, and I guess the other piece of that is, so what's the answer is you don't kick hard.
Yeah.
If you have very smooth, long, deliberate kicks, you can give yourself the same amount of
propulsion
of treading water without causing this very chaotic environment for lines to wrap around you. And even in the world wherein lines do get wrapped around you, a very easy way to get out of them is point your toes and do like lock your legs and do very smooth, long kicks. Think like toe pointed pivot from the hip, as opposed to like soccer kicks, like toe pointed kick from the knee.
Yeah.
Doing those, you are going to cause just a really chaotic environment in the water column. And so going back to, okay, well, what's the way to get out of a harness? So as one of the things that we learned was like, well, again, in this idea of like, while you're in the water, it's hard to pull from against things. Like you don't have something to go off of. So what we found was instead of trying to be vertical in the water column and take it off as you normally would, instead pop to your back and kick away from the from the canopy. And so when you're on your back, you have your chest big and you sort of are looking up and your mouth's out of the water so you can breathe. And so again, you do the slow sort of smooth kicks to get away from the canopy. And then what happens is you hit line stretch. So now you have something to anchor against. And trying to tow a canopy through water versus through air, you're not going to pull it.
Yeah.
Like you are not going to tow it. So you basically now just have this anchor against which you can kick. And so you don't even need to completely take everything off. You can just get to line stretch on your back with these sort of smooth flutter kicks and swim yourself out of the harness. And we found in doing that, like the first time through, most students, could get out, and even if however tangled they were, big chest, couple fresh breaths of air, take a second. Okay, smooth flutter kicks away, the canopy anchors, and you just sort of get things a little bit loose and you can kick right out of the harness.
Yeah, and just with loosening the chest strap a little bit and then just swimming your shoulders out, and the leg straps seem to come right off after that without having been loosened at all.
Yeah, it was like you really don't have to completely fight to get your chest strap off. It's really like you just get everything a little bit loose. And with that anchor against you, it's pretty easy to get out of.
So can we talk about solving these problems underwater? Because I know that's another thing that you brought up, both in getting out of lines as well as getting out of the harness, which might also transition into the next thing that I want to talk to you about, which is solving down.
Yep. So the concept of the concept of solving down is one that's really hammered into you especially as you go through the instructional ratings, but in scuba diving as a whole. And the concept is that a lot of the time it is easier and it is a more optimal outcome to try to solve the problem underwater. And instead of going down the thought train of, well, I'm scuba diving and something went wrong, So I want to not be scuba diving anymore.
Yeah, let me get back to safety, back to land.
Yeah, and safety equals surface.
Right.
Right. So, imagine you and I are on a scuba dive and we're going, and who knows, I kick you in the face and your mask pops off. Or we're kicking along and your regulator just stops working. You could immediately rocket to the surface and probably get decompression sickness yourself. Leave me on now a solo scuba dive where I then have to try to get myself to the surface, either at the same rate as you and we both decompress and there's no one to rescue us, or I try to get myself up to the surface at a reasonable rate and I hope that I can find you on the surface, or it's sort of any other number of terrible things.
Right. Doesn't sound good.
Or this, something goes wrong. Both your regulators stop working. You come over to me and grab my secondary. And I give you that, and we hand signal back and forth, and you're like, this is not working. I'm like, oh, okay. All right, well, now let's both take a breath and let's just sit here for a second, and we'll both kind of assess. Let's figure out what tools we have at our disposal and what problems we have in front of us, and work through them in sequence. Because while now we're still on the scuba dive, we're still scuba diving, but now we have a new problem, which is that we're both going to go through my air a lot faster than was planned. So, okay, we need to get ourselves to the surface. And this is especially relevant when you're in confined areas, like if you're under a deck of a battleship or you're in a cave or something. Trying to rapidly get yourself out of that situation as opposed to trying to solve problems in sequence is quite often the suboptimal outcome.
So how do we solve down when it comes to getting out of a harness or getting out of lines?
So one of the things with while they're all underwater is that there's buoyancy on your side. So when everything is underwater, the lines have their own level of buoyancy and they're sort of just floating around. If you try to pull all of those things out of the water, you're now fighting a bunch of heavy things that are getting pulled down by gravity at this point. And so you're trying to tread water with more, and it turns into just this mess of spaghetti against you, as opposed to if you take a breather, take a second, and look at the problem underwater. A lot of the time, it is much easier to untangle these things, and again, do these little flutter kicks and get away from it, while the lines are also in the water column, instead of trying to again get up to air and get everything dry to try to solve it. It's like no. Some of these things these are problems we should just solve underwater. And by doing so, be able to take advantage of the natural buoyancy of all those things.
So I kind of want to apply this also to the skydiving and base jumping environment in the air, because as you were saying, that example about solving down, it kind of seems to run in contradiction to some standard skydiving advice, which I absolutely hate, which is don't delay, cut away. Do as soon as you notice that there's a problem, base level contingency right now.
Yep.
What do you think of that?
Well, I think context matters, right? So in some of those, what those things are training for is people who do not also train, what are the other ways that I could solve these problems? So if you're not comfortable getting yourself out of diving line twists, if you're not comfortable, dealing with things stuck behind your head or your wingsuit having swallowed your cutaway cables, if you haven't had these things happen before and you haven't practiced them, then in that narrow window, just get a functioning canopy out might actually be the optimal outcome.
Though that seems like advice to subvert actually having to educate people.
Yeah, it's sort of a dogmatic answer, right?
Yeah.
It's just oh, well, this one's not working, so the other one will.
Right. Like I'm just going to skirt my responsibility to teach people how to solve all these intricate problems and be a critical thinker in an intuitive like way and just give them the stock advice of go to your base level contingency, which like not only seems like terrible training for base because you don't have that contingency, but also kind of, terrible educational practice in that we're not really teaching people anything.
Well, I mean, we're teaching them like at least a
contingency,
right? Like
Though, okay, then I'll also argue that point, and taking this back to scuba diving, right? All those malfunctions that you were mentioning, those are things that you train in a somewhat live environment before you take them to the ocean, right?
Yep.
And so like you wouldn't deal with a mask problem in the ocean not having dealt with in the pool. You wouldn't deal with a regulator issue like down at 100 feet if you haven't dealt with it at 30. Though in skydiving, at no point are you required to do
a cutaway.
Yeah. The base level contingency that is like supposed to be there to save your life. Like, what do you make of that?
Well, let me answer it slightly different. Do you remember the reactions that we got when we were doing intentional cutaways?
I do. Yeah. People were like, appalled.
And the reason why we were doing it was we wanted to not only get like what really we wanted to just answer a bunch of questions, and also we were like kind of just doing some silly stunts.
Yeah, it was
right?
fun.
Like,
yeah,
we did a Mr. Bill where you wrapped around me and then I cut away the parachute that we were both under, but you held on to it.
Yeah.
And like, and so we had done a lot of we were just toying around and being like, what would happen in these things? And so we're doing it super high up with a tertiary system that like, us plus Will helped build. And we were doing these things in a, air quotes controlled environment, but we were really trying to see like, hey, what happens with these? Like one thing that I did was I was really curious to see how many line twists I could get out of. As an example, like what would the worst opening look like?
Yeah.
And so I just on the ground took a canopy, like another epicene that we had, and just twisted it like the D-bag in my hands and just flipped it over and over and over and over again. And then got out and deployed this thing and had just an absolute barber pole of line twists. And so it was like kind of just this fun experience to be like, okay, well, what would make this better?
Right.
And also like in a case when you have that bad a line twist, what's that deployment like?
See, and that seems like valuable training to do as close to that malfunction as possible in an environment where we have the space to mess it up, which is like why I think like don't delay, cut away just sounds like the biggest cop out ever. And like, it seems insane to me that we don't have that as a requirement to like to execute a live cutaway before you even get your license. And like the counterpoint that I keep hearing is that, ooh, that's dangerous. And I'm like, okay, hang on a second. So it's dangerous to do a controlled, planned cutaway at, thousands of feet above our pole altitude intentionally, but it's not dangerous to just expect that somebody can execute that procedure under duress, potentially below their pole altitude and decision altitude.
At an altitude that they've never been before in free fall.
First time as their life is on the line. That's what? Like
I think the other one to me that I still think is crazy is that the average skydiver has no idea what a reserve pack job looks like.
Yeah.
That's the one that I think is astonishing.
Yeah.
That there's this massive chunk of skydivers that like just...
They never touch it.
They never touch it. Or if they do, they just know that it's yellow and it's a 126 or whatever. And they get it repacked every 6 months and like, that's that. But they have no idea what that pack job looks like. They don't know why it's different, what's unique about that system. Are there any intricacies of that system they should be aware of? Like, it's just this blind faith in the last option. And that I think is crazy.
And that's something that is easily changed. I mean, like if you're going to be a base jumper, anytime that you get a reserve repacked, go watch it get repacked. To put this like in perspective, you're going to be required on your first jump to do a better pack job deployed in a more dangerous environment than the FAA rigger that's packing your reserve.
Yeah, like, the generally advised hard deck is 1,000 feet.
Right, for a reserve.
For a reserve. And the entirety of a jump at the bridge happens in half of that.
Right. And that's going to be your pack job with no backup.
Yeah, that is a deployment. That's an exit. That's a deployment. That is a full landing pattern.
So one could argue that, like, in order to do that first base jump, you need to have a, better reserve pack job than the FAA rigger.
Yeah, than like the FAA guidelines.
Right. So, okay. Before we move on from water, there was another thing that got presented earlier in this podcast that a couple of people have asked us about, which is wingsuits in water and what we learned from landing a wingsuit in water, and if there was any advice on using the wingsuit as flotation rather than it like trying to kill you.
Yeah, if I were to land in water, I would rather be in a wingsuit.
Me too. Absolutely.
And that is probably pretty counterintuitive to a lot of people. But the reason is, think about how both flotation devices and wingsuits are constructed. Like a wingsuit is sort of 3 big pillows, right? 3 big pockets of air. And so one of the things that we learned in filling up wingsuits, which was a hysterical afternoon. We like grabbed a leaf blower and we're filling up wingsuits to full inflation and then jumping into our apartment pool and just having nothing but weird looks from the neighbors. But again, like this is how we tested these things, and we did it for hours to try to figure out different techniques and what's a good way for things to happen and what's a bad way for things to happen. But if you think about, sort of optimal case, you land a wingsuit, you deploy, you have a clean opening over water. You're like, well, I'm going to land in this water. And so you take off your wingsuit in the way that you normally do, right? You just unzip it and the tail's kind of flapping around behind you. If you then land in the water, big slow flare, go into the wind, then what's going to probably happen, what happened to us almost every time, was that the tail is going to flap up underneath you and between your legs. And so then what'll happen is you end up sitting in this like seat.
Yeah, like the wingsuit looks like a diaper.
It looks like this diaper where the tail is inflated still, partially inflated, and the wings will be partially inflated. And the tail, especially when completely unzipped, is more often than not, the weight of you laying in your wingsuit is actually going to pull that tail vertical, and it's going to pull the vents underwater.
Yeah, and facing down so that like the air can't escape.
So yeah, so it traps all of this into this like inflatable mattress. Same thing with the arms. The vents will be pointed up, so we found that the wings would generally deflate faster than the tail. The tail would stay inflated for quite some time. But in the same vein of loosen your chest strap and sort of slowly swim away from the gear, you were on top of an air mattress. Like it was a floating, like little boat. And so, my recommendation would be definitely once you land in the water, take a breath, take a second, loosen everything up. And then again, in the same way that we talked about getting out of a harness, really lay on your back, point legs, straight legs, and kind of flutter kick and shimmy everything off of you. I would then recommend just holding on to the suit.
Right. Yeah. By holding on to it by the ass, you could keep that flotation device going. And man, those things stayed inflated for a long time.
Even, and then we, right. And then we were like, okay, well, how long do they stay inflated? Does it matter how old the suit is?
Yeah.
Does it matter how big the tail is? Does it, what are the types of things that we did? And what we found was even on really old ratted out suits, like my ATC has probably close to 2,000 jumps on it now. And that suit held air for
15 minutes
15
at least.
minutes.
Yeah.
And brand new suits, we just got
indefinitely.
We just got over it. We
Yeah.
were like, all right, it's fine.
It's fine.
And then even like we had an old ratted out like P3 and a Havoc that we tried. Both of those held this massive pocket of air for 10 minutes.
Yeah, definitely enough time to like get to the shore in most cases, or like, pull out something to get a rescue.
Pull out something to get a rescue, or just hang out from there and like take your boots off and get yourself into a more comfortable swimming attire. Wave down a passing boat, whatever. So that was definitely a thing that I thought was fascinating. As a corollary to that, tracking suits in the water are horrifying.
Yep.
We could not come up with any technique, any tactic that didn't result in an actual rescue. We tried for hours using a lot of the same things that we had learned and putting together a course on how to not drown, and then an addendum of like what happens in a wingsuit. And then out of curiosity, we were like, well, what about tracking suits? And I think, and we did not come to a finding that I would be comfortable recommending to anybody. My recommendation would be, if landing in the water is a legitimate possibility, you probably should consider not wearing a tracking suit.
Yeah. Or bringing some flotation, like some added flotation with you.
Yeah, or bringing flotation, like that is definitely an option. But I think the idea, and it's because of the structure of how these things are built, right? Like you don't like take off a onesie in the same way that you do a wingsuit.
And they don't have the same inflation zones. Like there are these tubes inside that just like fill with water as soon as you land in them. And then you end up in this like baggy, draggy suit that's filling with water. Yeah.
And so tracking suits near water was one that I'm sort of, I'm of the strong opinion, loosely held, that it's a bad idea. Like if wingsuits near water, honestly, I think are not like it's a reasonable option. Slick near water, you can solve that problem. Tracking suits near water, I think it gives you're handicapping yourself. And I think especially on some of the exits that I've seen and places where I've seen rescues, like Campione really is one exit to call out, you're not getting any benefit from it. So like, there's another thing that we go over in the course is there's no such thing as the perfect gear selection, right? Everything has pros and cons. Like if I'm jumping near a cliff that's near water and I choose to wear knee protection, that would protect me if I hit the cliff, but that would hamper me if I go into the water. And so all of these things have pros and cons, right? There's no perfect choice. You should just be deliberate about what those choices are. And I think people should be deliberate about not wearing tracking suits off, specifically Campione, but really places where water landings are probable.
All right. Well, before we move on, is there anything else in the water section that you want to cover that we missed?
I think water, like anything else, can be a feasible landing area. And it, like anything else, has pros and cons. And so I think the framework that I teach in the course, when you're looking at water, is, can I land in it? Should I land in it? And how do I get out of it? And so assessing it from that framework, right? Like you might look at it and say, you're at the bridge. Can I land in the water? I could absolutely land in the water. Should I? Well, what problems would we be trying to solve? Like, is there a ton of boat traffic? Is that a thing that we need to worry about? Like it's July and there's 1,000 boats sort of ripping up and down.
Or is it January and it's freezing?
Is it January and it's freezing? Like the body loses heat in water about 10 times as fast as you do in air. So it's quite possible to go hypothermic in minutes. So that's, and we've both seen this at the bridge, right? People go into the water and they hop out, and then their canopy somewhere it's stuck in the tree, and they go to like wander back into the water to try to fight with their canopy in a tree, and they end up going hypothermic and like shivering, and you see them doing the not movie version of somebody drowning, right? Like not flashing and waving, but just worried looks in their eyes and the water going higher up onto their face. And so it's, there's pros and cons to all the things. What's a pro of landing in the water? You can hit the water about 5 times as fast as you can hit ground and have the same deceleration, have the same impact. So that's loosely the equivalent of a full-blown bury a toggle as hard as you can dive. You can hit the water at that speed and be okay. It's not going to be pleasant. I don't recommend doing that, but imagine doing that same thing over land. Like impossible. You'd break so many bones and or die on the spot. And so what's one of the pros of water? It's a lot softer.
Yeah, a lot of people have survived that shouldn't have by landing in the water.
Water's a lot softer. Like what's the Moab quote? The downside of landing in rocks is that they're mostly made out of rock.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's certainly much more that's involved on this course and much more to know about the water. But before we move on, maybe you can just run through a couple of the exercises that we threw people into, just to give an idea of, the level of training that we were shooting for.
Absolutely. And that actually also reminds me that I didn't bring up how to handle getting untangled in moving water.
Oh yeah, perfect. Let's do it.
So the progression that we did was to kind of slowly introduce people to what it's like being a parachutist in the water. So we would start with the canopy in the shallow end of the pool, and everybody walk up to it and then reach in about as far as you can to the canopy and push your arms into it. So like submerge your arms and wrap them in the canopy.
Getting that vacuum type feeling.
Get that vacuum sensation around it. And what was funny was like most of the time, most students would start it and immediately pull their hands out. It was like this.
Yeah, even though they were standing there.
They were standing. And most students would put their arms in and have that sensation of something being vacuum sealed against you and freak out while standing in waist deep water. So that was one of the things that we trained first, right? It was like, okay, this is a possibility. So let's get used to it and let's learn what it's like to, just think of your hands as mittens and still pull this thing off of you so you can get away from it. So then once we would do that, then we would start with getting people into and around the canopy. So then the first thing we would do is have them jump, like put on a full harness and then just jump into the middle of the parachute. And it basically simulating the sort of gnarlier version of that which they just did in the shallow end. So then they get themselves out from underneath or from this canopy that's vacuum sealed around them, swim away, flutter kick out of the harness, repeat. And then we would go up to they'd go up to the side and we'd wrap one ankle in. And then the same thing, jump into the canopy, get yourself out of it, and then try to swim away or clear the
entanglement
on your ankle.
Yeah, and then we would do like many entanglements, like
and then
around
we would
the arms, around the legs. Like.
Yeah, the full deploy. We would do tons of wraps around arms and ankles. We would tie knots around, like lines in a knot around a wrist with sort of partial like movement restriction where you couldn't, like as an example, completely raise your arm over your head. Like you could put it sort of out to your side and it would be stuck. And the same thing, into the canopy, completely tangled, solve problems one by one, and kick out and away from it. And then the last piece that we would do would then be to be completely tied, usually quite a few ties around the ankles was what we would generally do to simulate what would be the most likely, right? Would be that you're kicking too hard and you wrap your ankles, and so so you're tangled. And so we would simulate being in moving water by basically grabbing the canopy and towing them around the outside of the pool.
It had a pretty good clip too. We'd have a couple people holding that and running around the pool so that the person was going 8 to 10 miles an hour.
Yeah, pretty
fast.
They were setting a wake.
Yeah.
And so and learning how to get out of that. And really, like, one of the things that we learned in this is that in order to, if you can't immediately flutter kick your way out of it because something is, as an example, tied into a knot, then what you need to do is you need to get rid of that knot. But because this canopy is, well, and I guess one of the other pieces to bring up is get onto your back. So if you're being towed, you're going to be being towed sort of along the top of the water column. So either with your arms or your legs, just get onto your back. Like that way, again, your face is out of the water, and it's inconvenient and annoying that you're being drugged by your ankles, but like you can breathe. So once you're on your back, then you try to get this thing off. You try to flutter kick, that doesn't work. Okay, what next? Well, what you would have to do is change where the point of tension in that system is. And so by that, I mean, if you can't undo the knot because it's too tight, what you need to do is grab further up those lines, like past your ankle, and then pull yourself towards that. And so in doing that, because this canopy is towing you, right? There's tension through the canopy and through the lines. Then the point of tension becomes your hand. And so in doing that, you now have slack between your hand and your ankle. And so that allows you the freedom to be able to untie and maneuver lines and cascades out from around your ankle and off of your boot and out of your loops in your shoes. And then once you do that, then you can sort of slowly release that line out of your hand, and you'll know if you sort of cleared that tension. But that was one of the techniques that we learned in simulating and moving water, is like you have to create the point of tension so that you can create a space of slack so that you can really work to solve some of these more complex knots that would happen sometimes.
So I remember when we were doing this and creating these like worst case scenarios, a lot of people were watching us not involved in the course and kind of wondering what the heck we were doing. And oftentimes people would come up to us and go like, are you guys doing like special forces training or something? I mean, we had like, full scuba kit, in the water with like these, multiple instructors topside doing some pretty aggressive training that, left people in incredibly dangerous situations. And at the time, like, it didn't seem like that out of the ordinary. It seemed like we were doing something that should be standard. And my question is, what do you think of the standard of education in skydiving and base jumping? What do you think of the fact that people were watching what you were doing and going, this looks like Navy SEAL training, even though you're like, this seems like kind of basic stuff?
I think that skydiving specifically has this naivete or this desire to be proud that what we're doing is just so different, and therefore what other curriculum doesn't apply. Like, and I think that skydiving really just tries to create people who can get out of an airplane and get a parachute out. And if that parachute doesn't work, get a different one out. They don't, the curriculum is not geared to creating high performing skydivers. And when you look at other parachute sports like paragliding, as an example, there's a very clear progression on how do you do these things. And really in that, doing an SIV, which is a course where you basically just simulate malfunctions and how to get out of them and how to try to manage them and what happens to the wing in each of those scenarios, is part of the curriculum. Like, part of the curriculum is simulating incidents. And so I find it just fascinating that skydiving doesn't do that same thing, and instead takes an approach of, if you follow this checklist, you won't have incidents, as opposed to incidents are going to happen. So here is what it might look like. And so let's train for it.
Culturally speaking, without getting too deep into, what changes we could make in skydiving and base jumping progression, how do you think skydivers and base jumpers should be valuing their education? Like if we're slightly behind paragliding and slightly behind these other extreme sports in our methodologies for teaching, you know, where should people be assigning value to their skill? Where should, like, what level of expertise should they be giving themselves, having gone through the standard education in both of those realms?
I think it's light, right? Like it's very top line. And I think, when you come out of NFJC, like, are you a base jumper? Like, no, you're somebody who sort of knows how to maybe jump this one object in a narrow window of conditions. And I think that gets missed by sometimes. What I will say, and I think to several people's credit, is I think that some of the courses that are being run now, the more formal courses, like Scotty's and Sam and Dukes, like, I think that what I've seen in the last few years of spending a lot of time in the Valley is the people coming out of those courses have a pretty good understanding of that which they know and that which they don't. And I think and what I would say sort of as a counter or a corollary is I think that a lot of the people that I meet in the Valley who seem to not have that either went through a bad course. And like, I would define a bad course as one that's much more yeah bro than scientific. And I think that people who only have had mentors and haven't gone through a course, I also see exhibiting a lot of that same thing of just this sort of like blind naivete of this, like a total lack of unknown unknowns, as opposed to showing up in a new place and saying, wow, I really don't know anything about this place. They'll show up and say, oh, I want to do these exact exits and I know that I've got it.
So let's talk about your progression for a moment and wind the clock back. And the question is, if you had to repeat your progression over again, what would you do differently? Or anything?
I mean, I don't know that I would do much different. Like I do, and I think to answer it slightly, like a question slightly differently than was asked, which is, what parts of my progression do I think really mattered? Like really made a difference? I would say it was drilling canopy accuracy from a very early on sort of stage. I would say that it was spending a ton of time flying wingsuits. I would say that it was a ton of time racing. I think, like, I know several people on the podcast who are also base jumpers, who are wingsuit base jumpers, who also fly performance, say that it's the most valuable thing that they did. And I wholeheartedly agree. I think that for me, one of the things that was the biggest learning coming out of racing was getting to a point where you know that a suit is going to do something before it does it. And acutely lose control. Like, this is what it feels like right before I flat spin. And this is what it feels like, but right before a wingsuit stalls. And I think one of the things that that I found was that the more time that I practiced some of those, flying right on the edge of the flight envelope of a wingsuit, was that I would get a better sense of those things earlier. So the first time it happens, you're like, whoa, I stalled. That was weird. Or all of a sudden you're, going, absolutely mocking. And then you get a little bit of the sort of wobbles, like pilot induced oscillation. And then it absolutely snaps out on you. And like, wow, everything is just like streak of brown, streak of blue. That's my vision. Like, oh no. Okay. Point it at the dark thing. And so getting to the point where you start to notice those things before they happen, I think make you a much more well-rounded pilot. because it allows you to spend more time in those high performance parts of a wing, or at least the confidence to, should you need to, and know when you're pushing it too hard, when you're flying the suit too fast, or you're trying to glide it too hard. And it gives you data points earlier from which you can then make a decision.
So I want to kind of pick up the pieces on the performance flying that you just mentioned before we move on to the end of this episode, which is culture. And you've mentioned several times during this episode about how you crunch numbers and how you use scientific tools. And a lot of times I've heard that scientific tools are the death of intuitive flying. Do you believe that to be true? Do you think that scientific tools lead people further from being an intuitive operator?
Not at all. I mean, I think it expedites the intuitive action. It makes it so that because I think, especially if you're training to do something like very particular, let's say a flare. I want to do the max flare. You have no reference points in the sky to do it. And even if you're doing it in the base environment, you just don't have the reference points to know if you've been fine tuning it correctly or if you're doing it consistently. Because you can do 5, 10, 15 flares in a row and they all might feel kind of similar, but they might be 40 meters apart in performance. And so I think one of the things that having objective data in these moments gives us is that, like, is better to be wrong or vague. I can tell in which of those flares I was wrong. And then I can learn from them so that I know what right feels like. Because when you're flying, you can't be making decisions in real time, right? Like, these things have to be reactions, and they have to be reactions that you've trained. And so by knowing that, like, what it feels like when a suit is doing something, it allows your, I think, subconscious really to be able to make these choices and make these subtle little adjustments to keep you flying in the way that you need to. So no, not at all. I think that all those tools help.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, those scientific tools are really training your intuition.
Agreed.
Okay. So moving on to culture, and maybe we start with the easy one because I know you have an answer for this. What are some of the blind spots you think our community or culture has at the moment?
Yeah, so one that I've already answered, which is dogmatic responses and just oversimplifying things that we should, as a community, instead be researching. Like, I think that's one of them. And I think one of the other ones that I know is the one that you're asking about, that I know is a hot button for you, is the idea of a full recovery. Like, I think that, you hear it all the time. Somebody has a really bad crash, and somebody says,
but they're going to make a full recovery.
They're going to make a full recovery. And you're like, they broke 4 vertebrae, tib-fibbed on both sides, broke something in their ankle, and they compressed their spine. Like, oh no, but like, they had surgery and they're going to make a full recovery. And it's like, have you ever sprained an ankle?
Yeah, it's never the same.
It's never the same. And that is a reasonably minor common injury, right? But once you sprain an ankle once, like, you are going to just keep spraining it. And I think that, again, in a similar vein to being dogmatic and downplaying things, downplaying the complexity or the ambiguity of some of the problems that we're trying to solve, or things that impact the sport, by downplaying the impact of incidents, we're lying to ourselves about what the consequences are.
Totally. And I mean, one could say that, getting seriously injured is definitely not the end of your life. I mean, you can come back and still do a bunch of really cool stuff, but to say that you have unlimited body equity is just a lie. Like, you spend that equity with every injury, and with, every injury you end up with less overall.
Yeah. And some things heal better than others. Like, I raced triathlon in college, and I tore up my hip really bad. And that took me out of a lot of sports, especially endurance sports, for quite some time. But I mean, I was 24 when I did that. And so it's been over a decade now, and that still bothers me.
You also in a pretty serious motorcycle accident.
I had a really serious motorcycle accident when I was in my teens. And from that, like both of my collarbones aren't straight. I have nerve damage. I tore my entire shoulder labrum. And so like as part of that, I tore a bunch of the nerves that really like go up sort of where your lats are and connect to your shoulder. So I have just like this spot in the middle of my back that like I can't feel anything. But if you just looked at me, you're like, he made a full recovery. And, you know, I'm not trying to pity it, but I am trying to just be real about it.
Right. I think like, you know, full recovery in its colloquial usage means that nobody would be able to tell that you're injured just by looking at you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think people legitimately say it that like, no, they're back to where they were.
Yeah.
It's as if it didn't happen. And that's wrong.
Yeah.
That's not what happens.
Yeah. Especially with those complex joints like the shoulders, the ankles, the ones that like pivot and rotate and like bend. You know, modern medical science just hasn't come to the point to fix those things, you know, really, you know, at all. Like, I mean, a lot of times if you break those things seriously, modern medical science will recommend that you fuse them.
Yeah, I mean, especially with spines, right? And so I had a reasonably minor, but broke my back a few years ago, and because I didn't require surgery, it was like, oh, it's totally fine. And from that, like it took several months before I had flexibility and I didn't have sort of nerve pain, kind of just firing up and down my back. But that one has sort of by and large gone away. But in that same accident, I cracked both heels. And as a outcome of that, to this day, and this was, when did I do that? 2018?
Yeah.
19, maybe? 18. To this day, 6 years later, I have the sensation of rocks in my shoe. Is just like what my feet feel like all the time. And so like I've gotten used to it, you know, it's like I kind of just that's what it feels like, which most of the time is just
no big deal.
It's whatever. I kind of go on about my day, but then every now and then I actually do get a rock in my shoe. And I have on, you know, I live in Salt Lake. I'm just downhill from the foothills, and on trail runs on several occasions I have come home and taken my shoe off to a sock that is completely soaked in blood, and the arch of my foot, the ball of my foot, is completely destroyed and shredded because I just kept running because I thought it was normal. Instead of like no, I should stop and look at this. And so, you know, like I think, and again, in like the big scheme of things, like I think I've been fortunate. Like I'm still in reasonably great health. I'm reasonably athletic, have been able to travel the world and jump in so many beautiful places and have so many incredible experiences. But yeah, it hasn't been without like physical toll for sure. And I think, I just think that like people just need to be honest about it.
Yeah, that is definitely a blind spot and something that I think all too often gets disregarded, especially in people's early progression when they're going hard and people are telling them like, no big deal. Like if you get injured, you're going to make a full recovery. Like I know so many people that have had that injury and it's no big deal. So like, you know, keep ripping it, versus saying things like, you know, you should talk to all those people that used to be in the X Games and what it's like for them. You know, a lot of them have trouble sleeping, like wake up, you know, in pain all the time because of the injuries that they've sustained over the years, that still they made quote unquote full recoveries and came back and like were, you know, riding the pipe the next day and all this other stuff. Like the truth of it is that like they did not make a full recovery.
Yeah. Like they're continuing.
Right.
But it's, like things are different.
So on to the next question, which kind of perfect segue here. What have you gained from base jumping and has it been worth the cost?
I have spent time in some of the most stunning places on earth with some of my best friends and had so many of those moments of the fists and fives on exits, and I'm getting chills now thinking about it, is like, the laughing, running hugs in landing areas in Swiss valleys, in Kuala Lumpur, in Thailand. And some of those moments, like those moments, you can only be described to others who have had them, because they're so far from what I think most people can gather. Like, it's just so many orders of magnitude away from what people can gather. And I think that, like, I love all of those memories, and I think back on all of those memories fondly. And I am then also presented with, the names in my phone who aren't here. Like, I'm presented with the mothers of people whose BFL entries I wrote. Like, I'm haunted by the memories of clearing out somebody's hotel room, of talking to the police and seeing somebody's like wallet laid out on the table. Like, there's something really eerie about like just the things that were in your pockets or are in your pockets at any given time laid out on a table.
Yeah, somebody's life being reduced to a couple of photos and some, cards and memberships.
Yeah, to like their driver's license and an American Express and a debit card. Like, there is something that is so unsettling about that. But like, I don't think that one comes without the other.
So back to the question at hand, and maybe I can phrase it slightly differently. Knowing what you know now, if you had to do it all over again, would you still do it?
Yeah, I would. I wish that I still had my best friend. I wish that I got to hear his laugh again. But I loved all of the moments that we got and all of the adventure that we got. And I would have never met him if it was not for this sport.
So that's the next question. What have some of the most memorable or life-changing base jump moments looked like? Do you have anything to share on that front?
Yeah, well, I think I probably just traumatized everybody who's still listening to some of them. The dark moments are real and are hard to shake. But like on the upside and thinking on some of those, I mean, just all of those. And I think anybody who knows me and follows me on Instagram, like, one of the things that a lot of people like sort of give me flack for is that when I go on trips, I don't post any jumping. Like, I just post like the restaurants and like the road trips and
the cheese platters
and like the wine and like, videos of Price having steak tartare for the first time and he's crying because he'd never had something like that before. And like, those moments, or like, I mean, on some of the jumps though, like, I think one of the most memorable jumps for me was, well, a few. The first time I flew the crack and sitting watching my GoPro video of a flight that I had watched on YouTube for a decade. That sense of like, oh my God, I did it, was wild and so overwhelming and so powerful. And then, I mean, quite a few other wingsuit flights, like flying the Jungfrau Glacier was one that like I'd seen a couple videos of people terrain flying glaciers before, there's something in Chamonix. And when I got the opportunity to do that and like terrain fly a glacier, that was the coolest. One of the coolest flights of my life. Like, it was so overwhelming and so stimulating that like when we landed, the three of us that were on the jump, we all just landed in the landing area and at Via and sat down, and nobody could form a complete sentence. like we were so overwhelmed by the magnitude of that jump, and like seeing a glacier from not super high at, 200 knots, 225 knots, like it was incredible. And yeah, and just so many of the other adventures, like KL stands out. Like that's such an amazing trip. Like I think anybody who base jumps or thinks about base jumping, like watches the videos from Kuala Lumpur and is like, I have to do that one time. And that trip is every bit as incredible as all the videos make it look. And Tonzai, and yeah, there's so many. But then also like just the bridge trips, like just going to the bridge and hanging out with your friends and like hiking and catching up with people you don't get to see that often. It's really, I mean, it's the wildest. it's the Formula One of hobbies.
Yeah. Yeah. And truly deserving of all of the words that you had said. Oftentimes we are a little hyperbolic in our everyday language, but when you say amazing and fantastic and wild and incredible, in regards to the experiences that you're talking about, like they're totally fitting.
And I think it was like one of the other ones is you just end up in some of these places that are so incredible and so far off of what anybody else would run into. Like how many people over the course of human history have stood at Lemous?
Yeah.
A couple hundred ever? And it's like, this intersection of three valleys in the Alps where you have like 270 degrees of these incredible alpine views. And it's like a hour hike out of this silly little town. Just those moments are just so incredible. They're so powerful.
So speaking of these powerful moments, and let's look back a little bit over your entire career. If we were to write your autobiography or be able to turn your entire base career into some narrative, what do you think the title would be? And at the end of the story, what do you hope people would take from it?
I mean, I want to go with like a comedic answer because that just, I don't know, feels easier. But I think really I feel like the title would be something along the lines of like, I don't know, let's figure it out. Like, let's figure it out. Like, I don't, I guess in all of the same ways, right? Or like, just ask why.
Yeah.
And just keep trying to like really understand and just progress the sport. I think that to me, like, when the time that I came into the sport and the desire of mine to try to solve blank page problems so that people smarter than me or had more context than me or more experience than me could react to something, and we could progress the sport, and we could figure out a better way to teach people how to fly wingsuits or recover from instability or land in water or fly parachutes accurately or how to just teach better. I think all of those things are the pieces that are really important to me. I guess I hope that others would agree in that and hopefully leave a positive review.
I mean, Just Ask Why is a really good title. I like it both for the reasons that you brought up, also that it's like kind of applicable to everyone's career, like, and it's the most common question that you get asked from the public. Why are you doing this? And if the title is, that's right. That's the right question to be asking. Thank you. Just ask why. So after they read the book or saw the movie, last question on the table is, what do you hope they would take from it? They got to see your experience, they got to live it, secondhand. What should they come away from that movie talking about?
Be curious. I think it's probably it. I mean, or, another thing that you and I have talked about a bit in the past is like the idea that the world around you was built by people no smarter than you. And I think that, like, I know I always found that quote to be really empowering, where it was like, oh, well, I definitely couldn't go and do whatever thing, like I don't want to like try to make it that, flying wingsuits is this inspirational thing, but like it is a thing that takes training and discipline and like calculated thought and sacrifice. And so I think that in doing it and training and teaching people, I think, like, I don't know, like you can, like,
Yeah.
I'm no more special, I think, than the average Joe. I just really ask why a lot.
I like that. So they should come away with some empowerment to chase whatever dream that's in front of them, knowing that whoever they're looking up to is, at a level that they can attain to if they try hard.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Well, Devlin, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to record this episode.
Absolutely. Great to see you.
And we might have to have you back on in the future to talk about some of the other stuff that we've left on the table. But for now, that'll have to do.
Sounds good, man. Talk soon.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any thoughts about what you've just heard, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Big shout out to Mark Stockwell, our sound engineer and co-producer. We love you, and we couldn't do this without you. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, visit our website, exitpointpodcast.com. And if you're jumping out there, remember that experience is measured in walk-offs as well.